If you love Review Mirror Chronicles and want to help us keep the show rolling, the best thing you can do, apart from listening of course, is to share it with a friend or with anyone you know who's just a bit obsessed with history. The odder, the better. Thanks so much for your support, and I do hope you enjoyed this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hoxton. Let's begin today with what might just be one of the most beautiful passages ever written. Picture it. Spring at dawn, the edge of the mountains blushes red, and wisps of purple cloud float lazily in the sky. In the summer, the magic is at midnight, when the moon is bright and the fireflies begin their dance, flickering everywhere. Or maybe just a single firefly drifting softly through the darkness. Rain on a summer night, utterly enchanting. Then comes autumn, and it's the evening that grips you. The sun sinks low near the mountains. Crows fly home in twos and threes, wild geese form distant strings in the sky, tiny, unforgettable. The wind rises. In the deepening dark, you hear the song of the autumn insects, so delicate, so fleeting. And in winter, it's the early morning that stirs the heart. If it's snowing, perfect. If not, even a pure white frost will do. There's the simple pleasure of gathering around the brazier, adding charcoal to keep warm. Yet as the day creeps on and the air warms, the fire sinks to ashes, and the magic slips quietly away. Now, that, ladies and gentlemen, is not just a poem or a haiku, but the celebrated opening of The Pillow Book, an absolute masterpiece of Japanese prose, and I'd argue one of the most astonishing original pieces of writing you'll ever come across. Written in the early years of the 11th century, right in what is now Kyoto, then known as Heian. The Pillow Book stands alongside the Tale of Genji as the other towering classic of Japan's golden age. And, just as with Genji, its author is a woman. Her name? Sei Shōnagon. And just as Murasaki Shikibu, the author of Genji, she was a court lady. In fact, the two women served as ladies-in-waiting to rival empresses, living and writing at the same court, at the same dazzling moment in history. And they knew each other. They did not, however, get along. Murasaki, in her diary, leaves what can only be called a scathing review. Sei Shōnagon was dreadfully conceited. She thought herself so clever and littered her writings with Chinese characters that if you examine them closely, they leave a great deal to be desired. That, my friends, is the 11th century equivalent of a negative podcast review from a jealous rival. And while the analogy collapses when you realize both women were, in fact, transcendent geniuses, still, you can taste the envy. It's palatable. And why not? Both were absolutely brilliant. Both were daughters of civil servants. Shōnagon, like Shikibu, is a post in the imperial bureaucracy. Both were astonishingly well-read. Both knew Chinese, unusual, even scandalous for women of their day. While Murasaki tried to keep her knowledge discreet, mortified by the teasing of her fellow ladies-in-waiting, Sei Shōnagon did the exact opposite. She flaunted her learning, glorified in her wit, and never missed a chance to be the center of attention. She admits it herself in The Pillow Book. I am not renowned for my modesty or prudence. And you know what? It's actually utterly refreshing that she said that. If Murasaki was the shy, introspective genius, Shōnagon was the peacock, brilliant, bold, and absolutely unafraid to make a spectacle. And here's the thing. The last episode, when we marveled at the world of the Tale of Genji, I mean, how remarkable, how alien, how intricate it actually was. I have to confess, The Pillow Book might be even more remarkable. Not just as literature, but as a time machine, a window into the thoughts, the passions, the daily amusements of one of the most extraordinary women ever to put brush to paper. So, I've been reading the Pillow Book over the last couple of days, and honestly, what shines through on every page is wit, brilliance, and sheer personality. This is Sei Shōnagon's book. Her quirks, her eye for beauty, her razor sharp tongue, dazzlingly intact after 1,000 years. I mean, in all of the ancient or medieval literature, where else do you get such vivid, unfiltered, unadulterated charm? Where else do you feel that by the end, the author, not as some distant figure shrouded in myth, but as a living, breathing presence, rolling her eyes, making you laugh, letting you in on her private jokes? It's astounding. And then you really have to pinch yourself. This isn't the voice of a modern memorist or a witty travel writer. This is someone writing in a world where, back in England, Ethelred the Unready is desperately scraping together Danegeld to pay off Viking raiders. It astonishes me, truly. But how did Sei Shōnagon come to write this one-of-a-kind book? Well, like everything about her, the story is laced with wit and just a bit of mischief. The name Pillow Book comes from the origin story Shōnagon herself gives. One day, the Empress receives a great sheath of paper as a gift from a minister, and with royal generosity, hands it over to Sei Shōnagon. What does she do? She begins jotting down her observations, notes, diary entries, passing thoughts, keeping the sheath tucked under or beside her pillow. Later, after she's left court, the story goes that a governor visits her home. Caught off guard, she whips out the pillow for him to sit on, only to discover, horror of horrors, the hidden pages tumble out. The governor then gathers up the scattered leaves and, as legend has it, hangs on to them for ages before finally returning them. That, Shōnagon claims, is how her writing first became known. But here's the thing. You can never quite be sure with her. She's playful, endlessly ambiguous, always spinning a new angle. When she claims to be mortified at her writing being seen, you actually get the feeling that she's poking fun at the expectation that women should be modest and bashful about their talents. Subtle satire, centuries ahead of its time. For anyone who hasn't dipped into the Pillow Book, let's explain what exactly it is, because it's unlike anything else from the medieval world, or any other time, actually. It's not a novel. It's not even a straightforward diary. It's a wild, brilliant compilation of thoughts, anecdotes, lists, sketches, and poetic descriptions. One moment she's cataloguing the glories of nature, how delightful a temple bell sounds on a freezing night as you snuggle under the covers. The next, she's gossiping about life at court, recounting romantic escapades or rating the top ponds and mountains, occasionally rating horses. The genius of it is that the format allows Shōnagon to write about anything that catches her fancy. The joy and specificity which she describes small pleasures, like the distant peal of a bell or the soft glow of fireflies. It's something any reader anywhere can actually connect with. There's something universal in her happiness, and you're right there with her, warm in bed, the cold night outside, as the temple bell echoes across time. And then there are her lists. Oh boy, does she love a list. Top mountains, top birds, best horses. She's not a fan of the heron, by the way. She says it looks absolutely horrible. It's a habit that's become almost a national pastime in Japan, and you see it even today, ranking castles, cherry blossom spots, or train lines. And it all starts right here with her and her playful, razor-sharp catalogue of the world. And then, of course, there's the Mandarin duck. She is positively sentimental about them. She writes how touching it is, the way the pair will change places on cold nights, each one brushing the frost from the other's wings. The Japanese, as it turns out, have long been keen on the Mandarin duck. seeing it as, I suppose, an emblem of martial fidelity. You know, even in the Tale of Genji, when Genji strolls under the moon with Murasaki, it's the sight of a mandarin duck that triggers a rush of memory. Suddenly, he's flooded with nostalgia for all those perfect, vanished evenings with his great love. It's that unmistakable Paustian moment, you know, a bird, a memory, the ache of time passing. But I think what really makes the Pillow Book unmissable, what frankly makes it so shockingly modern, are the lists. They're proto-listicles, centuries before BuzzFeed or blog culture. And I have to say, a touch Wildian in their dry observation. There's her list of things people despise, and among them, people who are famous for being exceptionally good-natured, which, let's be honest, is a bit Oscar Wilde-ish. Or her rare things, you know, a son-in-law praised by his wife's father, a wife loved by her mother-in-law, and for sheer practicality, a pair of silver tweezers that actually pull out hairs properly. She knew life's true struggles, didn't she? And then there are the embarrassing things. Timeless, instantly relatable. The horror of listening to another parent gush on about some wretchedly precocious child, mimicking the creature's every word and mannerism. She's not a fan of children. Frankly, she accuses 3-year-olds of being smug and cocky, and it's hard to disagree. Or repulsive things, the inside of a cat's ear, or with glorious passive aggression, the way a man must feel when his wife, who is not very fond of him, has zeal for a long time. There's nothing quite like it. And then the anecdotes, like the time of the great snowfall at court. The gardeners pile up all the snow into a huge mountain, and the empress and her ladies, including herself, set up a sweepstake on how long it'll last. She is sure she'll win. Every day she goes out to check the increasingly grubby, shrinking snow mound. Against all odds, it holds on. She's on the verge of victory, until one morning it simply vanished. Turns out the empress couldn't bear to see her win, so she had the gardeners quietly sweep it away in the middle of the night. She then complains to the emperor, who only smiles and says, "Well, I suppose she just didn't want you to win." This is life at the very top of the Heian court, with all its intrigue, pettiness, and the joy of small things. Imagine for a second if we had stories like this from the court of Edward the Confessor. But of course, it would have been impossible. This kind of writing, so light, so personal, so slyly self-aware, could only have come from the singular, rarefied atmosphere of Heian, Japan, with its playful, competitive literary salons. Yet, as modern as she sometimes feels, her gripes about the tweezers, her love of lists, her eye of gossip, she at heart is a creature of her world. She's dazzling, she's aristocratic, she's steeped in ritual and competition. She gives us court culture at its wittiest, its cleverest, and I think also its most beautifully spun. And I think it's that mix, the feeling that you both recognize and are utterly bewildered by her world, that makes the Pillow Book such an endlessly rewarding, endlessly strange work. There's this lovely word in Japanese, yukai, that means delightful, amusing, charming, fun, exquisite. It crops up everywhere in her writing. So many moments, so many scenes at court are delightful, and it's the exact note that rings through her book. She's enchanted by wit, by beauty, and by the absurdities of life. But if you turn to Murasaki's diary, you get a very different mood. Murasaki is more introverted, more somber, sometimes even morose. And her portrait of court life is darker, laced with loneliness and longing. And here's the contrast. Sei Shōnagon absolutely adores gossip. She praises it as one of the great joys of existence. What could possibly be more entertaining than discussing and criticizing others? Murasaki, by contrast, frets about being a gossip. She confesses her sense of isolation, her guilt, her inability to fit in. And if I had to choose a guest for our show, it's pretty clear who'd be the life of the party. But bring their writings together and you get a sense of the Heian court as civilized, refined, almost to the nth degree. You know, when the Japanese look back and celebrate this era, the Heian period, as the golden age by style, elegance, and sophistication, they're not wrong. This was, by any measure, the very peak of courtly culture. Now, to really appreciate that, consider the central role of poetry. For Sei Shōnagon, as for Genji in Murasaki's novel, poetry isn't just a pastime. It's absolutely everything. It's social currency. It's how you flirt, how you build status, how you win hearts, and how you show you belong. Ivan Morris actually puts it perfectly. He says, the composition, exchange, and quotation of poems were central to the daily life of the Heian aristocracy, and it is doubtful whether any other society in the world has ever attached such importance to the poetic versatility of its members. You know, at court, you were expected to recite and compose poetry on the spot, almost like having to, ace your IT skills in the modern workplace there and then. Sei Shōnagon was a star, both as a poet and as a critic. If someone sent her a poem, she could actually rework it there and then. She could twist it, and she could respond immediately with exquisite wit. But it was also a bit of a high wire act. One slip, one dull line, and your reputation could be in tatters for years. Even Shōnagon herself admits to moments of pure anxiety. There's a scene early on where the Empress passes around a folded piece of paper to her ladies-in-waiting and says, "Write down the first ancient poem that springs to mind." Shōnagon panics, turns to a male official who just pushes the paper back to her and says, "This is no business for men. Write your own." She sweats. She dashes something off and then, in the classic Shōnagon style, praises herself. "I do think my poem was not the sort of thing a young person could have come up with." But you sense the pressure. Every slip is fatal at the top, with rivals waiting to pounce on a mistake. And of course, it's not just what you write, it's how you write. Calligraphy mattered enormously. In Murasaki's novel, Genji assumes that beautiful writing reveals a beautiful soul. Good handwriting was a mark of moral and aesthetic refinement, and to be truly civilized, you had to be a master of both the written word and the written form. So poetry was absolutely everything. Love letters, they were status symbols, party tricks, even a battlefield for reputation. No wonder the court was so full of anxiety. But also, I have to say, full of such astonishing creativity. There's an entire chapter in the Tale of Genji where Genji and his friends just sit around and talk about calligraphy. Seriously. For them, it's one of the most important things in the world. The consensus? Everything in the realm is going to the dogs except for calligraphy, which, to everyone's delight, has only improved. Sei Shōnagon, of course, feels the same. In her endless lists of things that make her cheerful, right at the top is something written in very delicate strokes with just the tip of an almost impossibly thick brush on a lovely, clean, white sheet of Michinoku paper. And what that tells you, folks, is that we are miles away from the world of the Anglo-Saxon kings. But if anyone thinks this was just an effete pastime, think again. Poetry and calligraphy at the Heian court weren't just for show. They were the lifeblood of romance, of social standing, and, let's be honest, sexual intrigue. To be successful in love, you had to be a master poet, a connoisseur of beautiful handwriting, a wizard with incense, and a virtuoso of aesthetic taste. A good chat-up line these days? trivial by comparison. In Heian, Japan, your entire romantic fate might hinge on the subtlety and the wit of a single verse. Effectively, your window onto the world. And I have to say also, the system was built for it. The rules of court were strict. Women in particular weren't meant to show themselves to men who were courting them. Instead, they would sit behind screens, hidden from view. So how did you win someone's affection when you couldn't even see them? You wrote poetry. You sent verses. You exchanged lines, trying to outwit, outshine, and outcharm one another with nothing but ink and your imagination. If your poetry hit the mark, other makers of taste, like scent or calligraphy, could be revealed, and the dance of courtship then moved to the next act. This was Genji's genius. In Murasaki's novel, he's the master of all these arts: poetry, calligraphy, and the subtle use of perfume, the elegance of dress. The women might allow us just a glimpse from behind the screen, a whisper of a long sleeve, a flash of color. And if things progressed, a woman who decided to admit a suitor would signal her willingness to begin a series of secret nighttime visits. Secret, though, is a bit of a stretch. Privacy was practically non-existent. Screens and sliding doors are no match for the curiosity of a palace full of servants and rivals. Information was everything. Everyone saw something sooner or later. And I think that's why in both the Tale of Genji and the Pillar Book, the coming of dawn is such a recurrent theme. Lovers murmur their last endearments in the soft blue light, only to be startled by the caw of a crow. And that's a sudden reminder that, for all their secrecy, the world is waking up around them. Shōnagon describes these scenes with perfect poise. And there's a passage where a woman, after a night with her lover, is lying in bed, and as her suitor leaves, another man passes. He's just left an assignation himself. And through a gap in the screen, he glimpses her still lounging on the futon. She knows she's being watched, and it's all described with such delicacy, such erotic tension, that you really do have to pinch yourself. This isn't Victorian England or even medieval France. The whole dynamic is different. It's delicate, melancholy, and utterly, utterly intoxicating. And this, of course, reflects a radically different world of social and sexual expectations. You know, in Christian Europe, marriage was supposed to be monogamous, affairs were dangerous, and romantic poetry was often just for show. In Heian, Japan, things were far more fluid. A courtship could end in marriage, in a secondary partnership, if you like, or simply as a fleeting affair. And crucially, women were not passive. They were players in this game, projecting their own appeal from behind those screens. Smell, for instance, was an abiding theme. In Genji, women worried about their perfume and even about their body odor, sometimes with real anxiety. But in classic Shōnagon style, she flips the script. You know, for her, a kimono that carries a faint whiff of perspiration can actually be quite alluring on a man. Something charming, she says, amusing, even exquisite. The delicacy of taste, of scent, of word was all part of their game. And that's what makes this world in Japan feel both so recognizable and so wildly alien. Every aspect of attraction, poetry, perfume, calligraphy, the rustle of a silk sleeve, was woven together into the fabric of desire and daily life. The rules were strict, but the rewards for mastery were immense. And it's not just poetry and scent. Every aspect of country life was laced with ritual and erotic nuance. Even the smallest gestures mattered. Shōnagon gives practical advice for lovers. If a man is visiting and the woman is behind a screen, how's he to know if she's actually there? She suggests, quite helpfully, that the woman should give herself away by shifting slightly, letting her robes rustle, just enough to hint at her presence without actually breaking the rules. The whole process of a choreography of suggestion. All these rules, so seemingly restrictive, actually become a playground for intimacy and self expression. The clothing, in particular, was not simply about warmth, though, as anyone who's experienced a Kyoto winter knows, it was absolutely essential. It was also about projection. The court ladies swathed themselves in layers, gowns, mantles, jackets, often 10 or more at once, each layer visible in glimpses at the sleeve or the hem. The Pillow Book is a Penguin classic, and it even includes diagrams so readers can actually appreciate the scale and the splendor of these outfits. It's worth the read. Clothes just weren't fashion, they were identity, emotion, even flirtation. The choice of fabric, the cut and pairing of colors, the arrangement of the sleeves, all were clues to a woman's personality and her mood. As Chris Harding points out in his History of Japan, our modern concept of fashion doesn't quite capture it. In Heian, Japan, constructing your outfit was a form of creative expression, absolutely central to how you presented yourself to the world. Physical ideals, too, were very distinctive, often strikingly different from what we would expect today. The big movement, of course, comes when, after all those poems and late night whispers, a woman finally chooses to reveal herself. The man, who may never have seen her before, finds her not just dressed, but transformed according to the highest ideals of beauty. Their teeth were blackened, a sign of status and erotic allure. Eyebrows, plucked out and painted on, high on the forehead. Plumpness was prized. Thinness was an absolute turnoff. And nudity, far from being desirable, was actually considered off-putting. Unforgettably repulsive, Murasaki writes. There's a sense that the erotic charge comes not from the body itself, but from the artful concealment, the layering, the subtle unveiling. But above all, the real obsession was with hair. The longer, the glossier, the better. Again and again in the Tale of Genji, it's a simple glimpse of a woman's hair, shining, impossibly long, that actually drives Genji wild, prompting a barrage of poetry, and ardent courtship. It's genuinely hard to think of another culture where the literary and the erotic are so thoroughly entwined. Poetry isn't just a courtly ornament, it's a passport to intimacy, a language of longing, a trigger for desire. No wonder the writings of women from this era are so psychologically rich, so layered, with tension and coded meaning. Heian courtship was an art form, half hidden, hyper literate, and alive with possibility. And the great women writers of the time, from Murasaki to Shōnagon, turned it into one of the most fascinating literature that the world has ever seen. And it's not just Murasaki and Shōnagon. There's other women, other giants of this golden age. There's Izumi Shikibu. She's sometimes described as a femme fatale, a poet with a reputation so potent, so notorious, that she blazed through 2 husbands and a scandalous roster of lovers, including not 1 but 2 royal brothers, successively, of course. Izumi Shikibu was celebrated for her poetry, but also for her wit, for her beauty, and yes, her ability to set the entire court talking. And she became kind of a living legend. Within just a few generations, people were already writing novels about her exploits. But what's truly fascinating is that her scandalous love life didn't tarnish her reputation as a poet. If anything, it seemed to burnish it. Literary genius trumped gossip every single time. In fact, Izumi Shikibu ranked 3rd on the 36 Immortal Poets list, which was compiled in the medieval era, a list that was actually dominated by the greats of Japanese verse. Her place was absolutely unquestioned. And this is the starkest contrast imaginable within the world of Christendom, or Rome, or ancient Greece. You know, in those classical societies, literary immortality was strictly for men. Persily in Athens, Augustan Rome, all the celebrated writers are male. But in Heian, Japan, during its greatest literary age, their top tier, almost every name that still matters today is a woman's. There is, honestly, nothing like it anywhere else in the world. No wonder Murasaki Shikibu and Sei Shōnagon were so proud of their world, and I think also so utterly convinced that the court was the only place worth living in. Everything beyond Kyoto was to their minds a complete wasteland. To leave the court was to be cast into darkness and barbarianism. Even exile, which is what happens to Genji in the novel, is painted as the end of civilization. If you remember back to part 1, Genji is sent off. You know, I suppose you would think from London it would be like being sent to Bournemouth, or from Moscow being sent to, I suppose, the wastes of Siberia. But to read Genji's laments, you'd think he'd been banished to another planet. The world beyond court is emptiness. All the light, all the meaning, all the beauty exists inside court walls. And the snobbery? Sei Shōnagon turns it into an art form. She really does. She famously leaves Mount Fuji off her list of Japan's best mountains because it's too far away and it's actually not worth the bother. Her lists of vulgarities are masterpieces of elegant disdain. Snow on the houses of common people, she writes, is an affront because the snow is exquisitely beautiful and should never be wasted on the unworthy. Is she mocking herself? Absolutely. But she's also revealing something deep and real. For the Heian aristocracy, if you weren't in court, you weren't really alive at all. But here's the final crucial, precondition for all of this. The reason Heian court could devote itself to calligraphy, to incense, to poetry, to fashion, and the exact, kind of snow, is that Japan itself was, for a time, unusually peaceful and secure. This was that time. They could afford, quite literally, to spend their days perfecting beauty, to writing poems, or being gloriously snobbish, about vulgar 3-year-olds, because there were no Viking raids. There are no marauding armies. There are no existential threats. They could turn all their energy inward. And I think the result was one of the most extraordinary explosions of female literary genius that the world has ever seen and probably will ever see. And of course, one of the threads that winds all through the Pillow Book is the sense of time passing, the inevitability of change, of aging, of loss. For all the glitter of the court, even the most exquisite pleasures are fleeting. The women and the men of the court know this as well as anyone. There's always that shadow of impermanence, that awareness that even the golden age will, sooner or later, slip away into memory. And yes, as much as I marvel at the surface, at the dazzling lists, the perfect calligraphy, the witty anecdotes, there is a darkness, melancholy, that sometimes seeps through. And perhaps that's most evident when you look at Murasaki's The Tale of Genji. Take that famously awkward episode with the Hitachi princess. Genji, after ages of wooing, finally sees her face. Her nose is long and drooping, her skin is bluish, her frame so thin as to be almost ghostly. And the disappointment is palatable, even comic. Yet Murasaki also paints a picture of real vulnerability, of loneliness, and of hardship. The princess, shivering in her ramshackle palace, isolated and scared, has become a symbol, a counterpoint to all that courtly delight. Even Genji, that supreme connoisseur, feels compassion and then installs her in his own home, rescuing her from that misery. This, I think, is Murasaki's way of reminding us court life wasn't all beauty and light. There's a frigidity, literal and figurative. The architecture with its endless screens and shadowy interiors actually ensured that women spent much of their lives in a perpetual twilight. And behind all those painted screens, I think it was often dark and cold, and dare I say it, boring. Most of the time, the grand affairs, the assignations of Genji or the Pillow Book were the exception, not the general rule. Yet even so, Shōnagon isn't lying to us when she writes of delight and charm and the joys of her world. As Meredith McKinney, the Penguin Classics translator, notes, the very act of creating the Pillow Book was an act of resistance. At a time of political crisis, when the court was threatened, when Shōnagon's own position was precarious, she chose to record only the exquisite, to carve out a vision of beauty and delight that shut that sorrow away. In a world where everything passes, her lists, her gossip, her lyricism become a bulwark against impermanence. So as we leave the court, what are we left with? A fleeting vision as lovely and haunting as cherry blossoms on the wind. For all its elegance, for its, I have to say, literary genius, its layers of silk and witticism, the Heian court was always shadowed by transience, by the cold reality of time and loss. And yet, what an amazing gift to have these women's voices echoing still, so vividly, so strange, so impossibly modern 1,000 years later. And I suppose really that's the end of the story for now. But as ever, I guess, if you want to truly understand the heart of civilization, you have to listen to its women, and you have to read their words. No one understands the beauty, the sorrow, and the fleeting joys of life quite like the writers of Heian, Japan. There's a weird and rather wonderful parallel that kind of comes to mind. As I was reading the Pillow Book over the last few days, it reminded me, odd as it sounds, I know, of P.G. Wodehouse writing the Bertie Wooster stories in the 1930s. There's that same genial sunlit humor, a world deliberately kind of sealed off from war, depression, or any sort of real darkness. The Pillow Book is like that. It's a deliberate refusal to admit shadow. It's a work of dazzling sophistication. And I also have to say sunny self-possession, crafted in hands that were perfectly aware of the darker, more conflicted world beyond the brocaded screens. But here's the thing, underneath the surface, the Heian court life was anything but tranquil. It was riven with intrigue, with rivalries, with jealousies, and even a faint whiff, I think, of a Game of Thrones. And the two literary titans we've been following, Murasaki and Shōnagon, were very much on the opposite sides of that political divide. This comes out right at the very first line of the Tale of Genji. The opening sentence is carefully vague about which emperor's reign we're in. It says, "In a certain reign, whose could it have been?" And it's actually a hint right at the start that the emperor himself is something of a cipher, anonymous, passive, and replaceable. And throughout the novel, emperors are constantly retiring or being shuffled off or replaced by another equally anonymous figure. And it's almost as if the throne has become a bit of a revolving door. And this isn't just literary device. It reflects a deeper historical truth. A century or so earlier, the great emperor Kanmu, remember him? The guy who left Nara to found Heian-kyo, our city of peace and tranquility in Kyoto, or that later became Kyoto. He'd actually tried to reassert imperial authority to escape the shadow of the great noble families, but it didn't work. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the emperor was less a ruler and more a celestial fixture, if you like. Like the pole star, as Joshua Friedman put it in his book on Japanese mythology. The pole star doesn't actually do anything. It just sits at the center as everything else kind of wheels around it. So too with the emperor. He is the symbolic center, the pivot of the Japanese system, but his actual power is more theoretical than real. And I think there's another Japanese term that captures this, Makaido. It literally means gates of the inner palace, the architecture standing in for the man. The emperor is both hidden away and hemmed in. He's he's kind of the invisible center, isn't he? He's cloistered in a maze of walls and ritual, very far removed from the everyday working life of the state. Even if you go to Tokyo today, the imperial palace is still like that. It's surrounded by massive moats and ramparts, utterly inaccessible. And the emperor is a presence you sense rather than you see. So if the emperor wasn't really running things, who was? We're not yet in the age of the shoguns and the samurai. Instead, the real power brokers at the Heian court were the Fujiwara, an ancient, supremely distinguished clan. Even back in Nara, they were already pulling strings, but by the mid-10th century, they'd turned themselves into the true rulers of Japan. Their genius was not brute force, but marriage politics. The essence was simple. Marry your daughter to the emperor. That way your grandchildren sit on the throne, your influence multiplies, and your rivals are kept at bay. The Fujiwara became the masters of this game, subtle, ruthless, patient. They didn't need armies or swords. They needed daughters, alliances, and the art of outlasting everybody else. It's against this backdrop that Murasaki and Shōnagon find themselves on opposite sides of a courtly divide, a world that, for all its outward elegance, is roiling with intrigue beneath the surface. To quote Ivan Morris, by the 10th century, the Fujiwara had imposed the emperor a life cycle that left him with almost no hope of independence. That pattern was fixed. An emperor would come to the throne as a green, untried youth, and he would immediately be married off to a Fujiwara daughter. His own son could be appointed crown prince, and by the time he hit 30, he would be forced to abdicate. And of course, then the process would start again. And it was a cycle that left the emperors permanently fettered by the marriage chains of the Fujiwara, a system from which there was simply no escape. So when Shōnagon arrives at court, the real ruler of Japan is not the emperor at all, but his regent, Fujiwara to Michitaka. And Michitaka has achieved this by marrying his daughter, Teishi, to the emperor, Ichijo, who at the time is only 11 years old. Ichijo's position is always precarious. Not only is he a child, there are 3 retired emperors still lurking about, still young enough, still diluting his authority at every turn. And he's been carefully raised to never even dream of challenging the Fujiwara. Teishi, meanwhile, becomes empress. She's the focus of Shōnagon's affection and literary devotion. Shōnagon, as lady-in-waiting, not only boosts Teishi's prestige, she becomes almost as famous in her own right, dazzling the court with her wit, her poetry, and basically her very presence. But both women know their status depends on Michitaka, keeping his grip on power. Beneath all the dazzling poems, all the laughter, there's always a faint sense of the precariousness, a bit like the ever-present black shorts in a Woodhouse novel, a little reminder that something darker always lurks just outside the sunshine. Shōnagon gives us a glimpse of this world in her writing. She praises Michitaka's elegance, how splendid he looks pausing to adjust his ceremonial sword. She relates with delight how his younger brother, Michinaga, bows so low before him, sinking to his knees in a display of courtly deference. Teishi teases her about her admiration, joking about Shōnagon's potential perennial favorite. But by the time Shōnagon is writing, everything has changed. Teishi has died, and Michinaga has succeeded Michitaka as regent, therefore ushering in a new order. It really is a revolving door of emperors. And with Michinaga comes a new wave of marriage politics. For all Teishi's prestige, she was merely Michinaga's niece, not good enough. Michinaga wants his own daughter, Shoshi, in pride of place. He doesn't demote Teishi, he simply promotes his own daughter, creating a new precedent. 2 empresses of equal rank, 2 rival courts. The game deepens. Michinaga also knows the value of literary stardust as well. If Teishi had Shōnagon, Shoshi would have her own superstar, Murasaki Shikibu. Murasaki wasn't just a legend, she was also a Fujiwara, albeit a less senior one. She enters the court as the perfect literary weapon. Suddenly the rivalry between these 2 women, so often cast as personal or literary, has another layer, a political one, driven by the machinations of their patrons and the ambitions of their families. It's Murasaki in the end who backs the winning side. A few months after Shoshi is promoted to joint empress alongside Teishi, Teishi tragically dies in childbirth. Now all eyes are on Shoshi. Will she bear a son and secure her father's power? She's just 10 when she's married off. It will be 8 long years before she becomes pregnant, years that are marked by tension, by gossip, and by literary invention. And when she finally gives birth, the stakes couldn't have been higher. If it's a boy, Michinaga's triumph is complete. It's against this backdrop that Murasaki begins her diary, this chronicle, not just of her own inner life, but of the most dramatic, high-stakes political soap opera in the history of Japanese court culture. This is why every poem, every letter, every list or anecdote, from this era is laced with pure anxiety and ambition and the constant awareness that status can be lost as quickly as it's gained. This is the stage on which the literary masterpieces of the Heian court were created. Part theater, part battlefield, part salon, with the fate of families. And actually, the future of Japanese culture, always in the balance. It's absolutely extraordinary, isn't it, to read one of the greatest writers of all time, Murasaki Shikibu, giving us real-time, almost journalistic accounts of an event so vital to the fate of empires. The empress's childbirth, the anxious waiting, the gossip, the palatable tension. Big spoiler, Shoshi survives. She has a son, and for Fujiwara no Michinaga, it's the masterstroke that cements his hold on power. And by the time he dies in 1028, he's been brother-in-law to 2 emperors, uncle or father-in-law to 3 or more, and grandfather to 2 future emperors. There's never been a more complete political insider at the heart of the palace. For Shōnagon and Shikibu, this is the complete turning point. For Shōnagon, the death of Teishi, her beloved empress, spells the end of her time at court. The Pillow Book, much of it likely written in retirement, becomes not just a eulogy to joy, but I think a testament to the fleetingness of joy itself. Murasaki, by contrast, finds herself drawn even deeper into the heart of power, her literary triumphs woven into the ambitions and also the insecurities of Michinaga and his court. But if you ask me, were these women happy? It's really hard to say. Murasaki's diaries, and even more so the Tale of Genji, are saturated with that sense of the impermanence of pleasure, the aching truth that every joy is shadowed by loss and that everything eventually slips away. There's that unforgettable scene late in Genji when our hero, now old, meets a woman he once loved, and he writes, "Who else but we two knows all that has brought us here?" What a statement. The ancient pines are witness, I suppose, living longer than lovers, than courtiers, than dynasties. And in Shinto, those pines are divine. They're actually touched by the gods and by eternity. In Genji, the poem hopes that love might cheat time, that something eternal might be found. But the real ache is that, even as he writes, Genji himself doesn't quite believe it. Why? Because there's another great inheritance from China, another thread woven through Heian life: Buddhism. It actually arrived centuries earlier and flourished alongside Shinto. In Heian Japan, there was no sense of separate religions as we think of them in the West. You might serve as a priestess of the sun goddess and pray for salvation to Buddha without a flicker of contradiction. Buddhism, however, offered an answer, of sorts, to the ache of impermanence. Yes, the beauties of the world, the calligraphy, the cherry blossoms, even love itself, they're all illusions. They're passing shadows. The hope actually lies in the promise of enlightenment, in the paradise, if you like, of the Western Pure Land promised by Buddha. It's no accident that both Murasaki and Genji long in their darkest moments for this release. Murasaki, like many women at court, was haunted by the fear that she might never attain enlightenment, that her only hope was to be reborn as a man. She writes, "Someone with as much to atone for as myself may not qualify for salvation. Everything conspires to make me unhappy." And I suppose, in the end, both women hope that love might transcend even death, that one day they will share one lotus throne in the life to come. The yearning for what is gone, the knowledge that all things vanish, is at the core of both women's writings. It's the same theme that runs through Proust, through the greatest works of world literature. The search for, I suppose, something enduring amid the constant flow of time. And I think that's what makes the Pillow Book such an absolute joy to read, and why it remains such an extraordinary window into Heian Japan. Not just because it's endlessly witty, surprising, and also entertaining, but because it lets us glimpse a world both alien and also incredibly familiar. We see the court, its intrigue and beauty through the eyes of two women who, for one dazzling moment, were the greatest writers of their age. And I have to say this, and maybe to end on this, if you've never read the Pillow Book, do yourself a favor and pick it up. You'll be pulled into a world as rich and strange as anything in history. One that, like all the best stories, leaves you longing for just a little bit more. I loved every single moment of diving back into that whole of kind of Japanese history. And it's been, if you'll forgive the phrase, exquisitely delightful. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.